Thank you everyone who's joining this webinar today as part of the Royal Agricultural Society of England's Farm of the Future webinar series. This webinar today is on enhanced rock weathering, crushed basalt, a sustainable solution for soil acidity, crop yields and climate. My name is Aaron Redman. I'm a soil scientist and soil and natural resources advisor at Innovation for Agriculture, the project delivery partner for the Royal Agricultural Society of England. And the topic today, rock weathering, is a natural process where minerals break down over time due to exposure to rain, air, and biological activity. And when silica and carbonate rocks like basalt or limestone interact with CO2, they undergo a chemical reaction, and this potentially, this can transform CO2 into bicarbonates and carbonates. This process has been picked up by the agricultural and wider industries globally, and I've seen a lot of activity in the UK. And could be a methodology that we can use to mitigate climate change and meet our national carbon budgets. So today we have two of leading experts on this subject. Professor David John Beeling is the founder and director of the Leverhulme Centre for Climate Change Mitigation and Professor of Natural Sciences in the Department of Animal and Plant Sciences at the University of Sheffield. He has an abundant knowledge on botany, paleobotany, paleoclimatology, which is basically the scientific study of climates predating the invention of meteorological instruments, so where there's no direct measurement of data where available. And also Professor Steve McGrath, who has 40 years experience in soil and crop sciences in a wide range of topics relating to soil crop quality, including carbon cycling and storage. Steve leads soils and nutrient program at Rothamsted and is also an honorary professor in the School of Biosciences at the University of Nottingham. He was distinguished visiting scientist at the Waite Institute at Adelaide University. His honours are vast, and Steve is recognised as a world-leading scientist in agricultural science, publishing over 366 papers and receiving the Royal Agricultural Society's Research Medal. So, yeah, two absolutely excellent speakers on this topic today. And rather than me try and get my head and explain this topic any further, I'll leave it up to the experts. So David, if you would like to start, thank you so much for coming.
Great, thank you very much, Aaron and Natasha, for the invitation to talk. I have a few slides, so I'm just going to screen share that. Switch the thing around so you can see it properly. You see that okay?
Yeah, that's
so as Aaron said, I'm the director of the Leverhulme Centre for Climate Change Mitigation, and our centre was funded for 10 years with a huge award of £10 million from the Leverhulme Trust, which is a UK charity that funds natural science and social science research in the UK. And our mission was really completely focused on trying to understand the potential for enhanced weathering to be a climate change mitigation option that works with agriculture. And so our centre is split across a kind of 4 different areas where we do large-scale field trials, trying to understand the performance of this sort of technology in the field. Earth systems modeling, where we kind of simulate the breakdown of the minerals in soils all the way from individual grains to the entire globe. We do social science work where we engage in local communities and different publics in different countries, trying to understand its acceptability. And then the kind of fourth area is more sustainability. What's the potential for increasing resource provision to deliver this through changing our supply chains? And I thought what I'd do today is just give you a very brief overview of what enhanced weathering is, in case you haven't heard of it, but then also just show you some of the results we published from one of our field trials in the US Corn Belt, just to illustrate the sorts of findings that we've been getting. So just to sort of take a step back for a moment, you'll maybe have read the Times this morning with Henry Badenoch rowing back on net zero, but Theresa May's parting shot was to enshrine the UK in net zero. And of course, preceding that was the Paris Agreement, where they wanted to limit warming to 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees. And in order to do that, we have to change the way society operates. And so this is what's happened in the last 100 years. This is emissions of carbon dioxide, mainly from burning fossil fuels. And you can see that they've risen from about, I don't know, just under 10 gigatons, that's a billion tons, 10 billion tons, all the way to 40 billion tons. And then in order to kind of limit to warming to 1.5 or 2 degrees, this is where we have to go for the next century, which is frankly unbelievable that if humanity could achieve this. So we've got to urgently slow our emissions of CO2 into the atmosphere by transitioning to clean energy. But even if we manage to do that, there's still a need to take CO2 out of the atmosphere. There's going to be some sectors of the economy, like agriculture and transport, that are very difficult to decarbonize. And there's also legacy emissions of CO2 that we're going to need to remove. And there's no doubt about it, this is going to be expensive and difficult. And it's much better to not to emit it than it is to try and take it out of the atmosphere. But nevertheless, we are going to need carbon dioxide removal technologies, and we can't wait until 2050 or 2060 to figure out which ones work. We need to get on and do the research now, all of the different technologies, to figure out which ones scale, where the opportunities are, and what the problems are. And so that's the background to thinking about enhanced weathering. It's one of the carbon dioxide removal technologies that's on the table. We don't fully understand whether it will work or not, and so we urgently need, long-term, in-depth research programs to figure it out. So enhanced weathering is, on the face of it, very simple. You have your crops growing in a field. Here's some maize. And then you apply a crushed rock like basalt. And then the CO2 in the atmosphere combines with water in the soil to form carbonic acid. And then the carbonic acid is quite corrosive, as is the activities of the roots of the crops and the microbes. And that helps break down the silicate rocks to release calcium and magnesium ions. And those calcium magnesium ions are then, because they're positively charged, they have to be charge balanced by the formation of bicarbonate. As Aaron said, this is the formation of soluble CO2, essentially, which drains into the soils and then over time is transferred from the land through river systems to the oceans. And so you have a system, a natural system of rocks that are weathering and chemically weathering and taking CO2 out of the atmosphere. And once it gets into the oceans, it's pretty much there for 10,000 years or more. And so that's, in terms of human timescales, that's carbon sequestered and out of the way. So three things to think about with enhanced weathering. The first one is it uses these natural reactions between volcanic rocks and plants. And these are the reactions that have been stabilizing climate over geological timescales. So they're natural reactions. It's not like direct air capture, for example. We also think it could be deployable at scale within a decade or two, because human societies have known for a long time how to do quarrying, and they've also applied rocks to the landscape, particularly limestone, for pH management. And then the third thing is you can co-deploy it with other proposed land-based carbon dioxide removal strategies. So, for example, If you were doing afforestation schemes or reforestation schemes, you could combine basalt with the tree planting. Or if you're thinking about biochar, you could combine basalt with your biochar feedstock plants. So it's, in a sort of jargon, it's stackable with other CO2 technologies. So a few years ago, back in 2018, we wrote a very detailed paper, 20 pages long, trying to explain to the world that this is not just a carbon dioxide removal technology, but it also has great potential to improve food security by increasing yields and also improve soil health. And so we felt, there's a kind of win-win here. You can take CO2 out of the atmosphere, improve food and soil security. And no sooner we had published this, then the editors at Nature wrote an editorial where they completely overlooked the realization that it could help food security and soil health, and wrote a very negative editorial comment about, and there's the key quote is I've just pulled out there: "Scientists must continue to spell out to policymakers the harsh realities of what negative emissions would involve in the strongest possible terms." And it was a kind of faceplant moment for us, because we thought, oh, they've totally missed the point of what we're trying to say. And then the following week, New Scientist wrote an editorial about the paper, which was much more positive, and they totally got what we were trying to say. And the key quote here is, what's uplifting about this idea is that it offers hope for the efficacy of geoengineering more generally. So the mission statement of our Leverhulme Trust, our Leverhulme Centre, was to be disruptive in our thinking. And I think those two contrasting editorials kind of show that we're fitting the brief. So in terms of the benefits for soils and crops, there's four things to think about. The first one is it can help reverse soil acidification. So those natural chemical weathering reactions that occur in the soil generate alkalinity, which reverses acidification of soils in agricultural soils, mainly caused by nitrogen fertilizers. The second thing is it can reverse silica stripping of soils. So many of our food crops are silica accumulators. By growing the crops repeatedly on the same soils, taking the biomass off site, you're slowly stripping biologically available silica from those soils. And so by putting a silicate rock on, you're replenishing those pools. And relatedly, you're also, by taking biomass off site, stripping those soils of essential micronutrients like molybdenum and also phosphorus and potassium. And again, as the basalt weathers, it can release these nutrients and replenish those pools. And then the final thing is it can improve overall soil health by improving cation exchange capacity, for example, nutrient holding capacity. It can stimulate root growth, and that in turn produces greater inputs of organic carbon. So two take-homes from this. The first one is it could increase crop production. And the second one is it could increase crop protection, because if you take more silica up, then the crops can build tougher cells and they're more resistant to biotic attack. And then the final question that we've posed there is really, if your basalt has got potassium and phosphorus in it, then you could potentially decrease your agricultural usage of potassium and phosphorus fertilizers. That lowers the footprint, the indirect emissions, but could also lower agricultural costs. So within our centre, then, we've set up a kind of global network of weathering sites to see how this actually works in different circumstances, different crops and different climates. We have 2 in the US Corn Belt with colleagues from the University of Illinois, 3 in the UK, one of which Steve will talk about later. And then we also wanted to look at how it performs in the tropics. So we have oil palm in Malaysia and Borneo, sugarcane in Northern Australia, and cocoa agriculture in Brazil. And I'm just going to show you a quick snapshot of the results, some of the recent results from the US Corn Belt. So in terms of the field trial design, we have 4 blocks. Each one is just under 4 hectares each, and it either grows maize and soy, or with and without basalt, or the bioenergy crop miscanthus with and without basalt. And then each one of those treatments is replicated 4 times with a separate 0.7 hectare plot, so we can see statistical effects of the treatment. And basically out in the Corn Belt, what they do is grow crops in rotation. So they grow maize, soy. Soybean is a typical rotation. And there's 2 reasons for that. One is cultivating maize requires a lot of nitrogen fertilizer. So after the second year of doing that, to grow a nitrogen fixer like soybean gives the soil a chance to relax. But also there's a root pest for maize, and by having the 3rd cycle as soybean, you tend to break up the life cycle of that root pest. So we apply basalt 5 kilograms per meter squared every year since 2017. And this is the result. So this is estimated amounts of carbon dioxide removal over the first 4 years of the trial. So this is carbon dioxide removal in terms of tons of CO2 per hectare. This is cumulative. You can see that it's about well, the first thing to see is that each one of these points is an individual measurement. You can see there's a lot of variability. These soils are very heterogeneous, and that is absolutely typical of soils the world over. But you can see that as we repeat our basalt applications, so that our cumulative amount of carbon dioxide removal increases to around 20 tons of CO2 per hectare. And actually, you can do some sort of fancy statistical analyses, which colleagues in the US did, which tells you about the minimum number of soil samples you need in order to converge on your stable annual rate of CO2 removal, which in this case is about 5 tons of CO2. And you can see that maybe you need a replication of 10 or 15 in order to get a reasonable estimate of carbon dioxide removal. So just going back to the original ideas then, does it really improve soil pH? And the answer is it does. So this is data for the same experiment in the US Corn Belt trials. And you can see this is the 0 to 10 centimeter soil depth on the left. And here's these open square circles show the classic sort of acidification as a result of maize soy rotation in the Corn Belt. And then in the filled squares, you can see the pH increasing as a result of the basalt weathering. And then on the right-hand side here, this is the same data controlled and treated, but for deeper in the soil profile. And again, you can see that the pH of the soil further down in the soil profile is still higher than the pH in the control plots. And then again, thinking about my earlier slide about yields, did we see a yield increase? And the answer is, generally speaking, we did. So first year we did it, we saw an increase of about 8%. So the open bar here is control, and the filled bar is the basalt treated plots. And you can see the filled bar is higher than the open bar by about 8%. Then the second year we did it, that disappeared. The third application was soy, and we got a big jump in soybean yields of about 16%. And this kind of fits with what we'd expect, because soybean is a nitrogen fixer, as I said earlier, and they have very strong acidification around the nodules, and that can drive more weathering and release more nutrients. And then we went back to a maize rotation, and again, we got a 12% increase. And in 2020, when we went back to the maize rotation, we included a liming treatment because we wanted to know, does the basalt give you something extra in terms of a yield bump, or is it just through a pH effect? And so what you can see then is that the liming yield increases is basically, it sits between the basalt and the control. So the basalt does give you something extra beyond just a pH effect on yield. And that's probably this replenishment of micronutrients. And then just one other slide to show you one of the most consistent things we've seen at the energy farm. 7 out of 8 years that we've done this is a reduction in nitrous oxide emissions. So I mentioned earlier that during maize fertilization, they put a lot of nitrogen fertilizer on. Then as soon as it rains, you get a burst of nitrous oxide emissions. And this is a big deal for farmers in the US and the UK in terms of trying to decarbonize agriculture. And although it varies from year to year, so it's a 20% reduction, 28%, 14%, 36% reduction, mainly due to variations in climate. It's a very consistent effect, probably linked to that rise in pH. So just to summarize then, this is what happens. You apply your basalt, it combines with the CO2 in the atmosphere to form carbonic acid, which eventually makes it to the ocean. The basalt can increase soil pH, release nutrients that stimulate growth in yields, but you do need to check for the fate of trace metals. And then in terms of the wins, you've got direct CO2 removal, you have mitigation of non-CO2 greenhouse gases like N2O, and then you have avoided emissions if you reduce your P and K fertilizers. And then in terms of benefits, you have almost unlimited carbon sequestration capacity because this, you're basically storing carbon in the oceans. And as I mentioned before, it utilizes technologies that we already know a lot about, mineral extraction and agriculture. It's synergistic with other land uses, and it creates social justice opportunities. So both in terms of the mining of the rock, creating employment, and also improving the value of the land. And then just to finish, as Aaron mentioned, there's now nearly 20 companies that have sprung up doing enhanced weathering. This combination of carbon dioxide removal with benefits for food and soil security seems to be like catnip to investors. And many of these startups are now operating all around the world. This is already out of date. They've raised nearly $500 million in terms of investment. There are sites now, multiple sites now in India and in Kenya and in Mexico. This is just a few of them. And I think, with great commercial, to paraphrase a previous prime minister, with great commercialization comes great responsibility for the scientists to try and do the most rigorous, transparent science so that the whole thing holds up and really does give us a credible approach to taking CO2 out of the atmosphere. So with that, I'll stop there.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, David. That's really interesting and a really clear overview an introduction into enhanced rock weathering and the science behind it. Just a quick question. How do you pronounce is it Leverhulme or
Yeah, Leverhulme.
Leverhulme? So yeah, it's great to see the work that you guys are doing. At this moment in time, I'll just use this moment to remind all the attendees, please put your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of Zoom. So that's the little square speech bubble with a question mark in it. And start to get your questions in because we have 15 minutes with Steve, and then we'll go into a Q&A session and we'll get some of your questions answered. So without further ado, Steve, hi, how are you doing? And you're presenting from Rothamsted. Hello, Steve, can you hear me?
Hello, good afternoon, everybody. I'm just going to find my slides if I can. And full screen.
You just need to put it in present.
It's okay, it's full screen now, I think.
There you go. Fantastic.
Okay, well, welcome everybody. I'm going to talk to you this afternoon about what we're doing in the UK. David's given a lot of background there. I'm going to tell you what we're doing at the moment, particularly focusing in the red there. This is the overall project. It's funded by the Greenhouse Gas Removal Programme in the UK. And for the enhanced rock weathering, we have 4 work programs and we have 3 sites shown in the map on the right. So our arable site is here at Harmenden in Hertfordshire. We've got a lowland grassland site in Devon at our site at Northwick. So those 2 sites are run by Rothamsted. And then there's an upland grazing site at Glynlimmon in Mid Wales, which is run by CEH. As I said, I'm not going to say much about the other sites apart from that. I'm going to concentrate on the arable site here. I'm not going to show you much in the way of results at all today because At Harpenden, we're ahead in the sense that we've done 3 crops, so a rotation of 3 different crops so far. And we're busy at the moment analysing the final data and starting to write the papers. The other crops over in the grassland sites are slightly behind us, so in terms of data, they're a bit more behind. We're basically looking at the impacts of the rock weathering and, you know, checking all of the good things and the potential downsides that David has already spoken about. And then you can see just really quickly there, we also have parts of the programme which are dedicated to public engagement, sustainability and scalability across the UK and over time. And then also a very important package on process modelling. So when you collect the empirical data that we're doing, you can then use it to extrapolate to wider scales and times using models. So at Harpenden here, the arable crops, we've made demonstration plots. They're 24 by 24 meters. I think you can see them there. The grey areas you can see just after we've added the basalt. These can be seen from the air, and in fact can even be seen by satellite, incidentally, which is interesting for verifying that the stuff has actually been applied to fields, or in this case to plots within a field. So far we've had a rotation starting with winter beans, winter barley, and winter oilseed rape, grown in replicated plots that you can see here from the air. And we've been applying to those plots on an experimental basis. We're applying with this machine that you can see behind the tractor, which very nicely distributes the basalt to the surface of the soil. And then we basically just tine it in so it's min-till before sowing the crop. So the basalt is here, the pile on the left-hand side at the top. You can see in the hopper here where we've got the dose which is going on each plot. In the 3-year rotation, we're also, I always say about this project, we're monitoring everything. So you've got a picture there. We've got a met station nearby, monitoring weather, again for modelling purposes. But also we're monitoring the crop yields, of course. Looking for any either increases or potential decreases in crop yield that may be attached to this. We're doing the soil sampling and analysis, which is basically looking for the changes in soil properties or soil quality, if you like, over time. We're measuring soil pore water, and we're doing the analysis of that. I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment. We're also looking at changes in biodiversity. For example, we're doing what's called a 30-minute worm study on our plots over time, but also fancy, molecular biology, looking at molecular markers of microbial diversity in soils. We're looking at soil structural impacts, if any. And as David has also mentioned, we're looking at the greenhouse gases. So we're actually looking at CO2, methane, and nitrous oxide emissions related to the treatments. The met station I've mentioned. I'm not going to mention much about the CO2 removal because those estimates that the analyses are ongoing at the moment. And the other thing we're doing on our site is monitoring the boreholes. This is relatively flat plateau land. We have boreholes. But there are nearby rivers, and we're sampling rivers for the modelling because, as David mentioned, the bicarbonate is going down into our aquifer and then actually emerges in a local river. So we're actually supplying data on the properties and the flow, etc., of that river for others in our programme who do the modelling, and then I look at river water ecology and so on and so forth. So that's the picture of the whole program, and you can see the collaborators in many centres across the bottom of the screen. So soil pore water monitoring. We've been doing this now, as I said, for the 3 years, for the 3 crops. These are inserted at 1 meter depth. And the pore water sampling takes place. You can see the equipment before it's inserted in the lab there. It's this little probe on the top right, which we attach a pump to. That's in the lab. If you go into the field, you need obviously to put a hole in, which we've got a nice little machine does that, which goes in at an angle. And actually that tip, which is sampling the water, is 1 meter deep. And you can see the pipe work there. Pipe work is brought to the surface for routine sampling during the season. Now that's important because what we're looking at, the weathering is obviously taking place where most of the basalt is, which is probably within about 10 centimeters of the surface, because we've been just shallow tining, as I mentioned before. So we see most of the basalt in that region. But actually the weathering and then the release of calcium and magnesium that David mentioned and the bicarbonate has to go through the soil and then actually leave the root zone. So we're measuring at 1 meter, which is basically, it's the bottom of the root zone. So we're providing information on how much weathering there is, how much CO2 is being fixed into that solution, and how much of that is actually leaving the plant root system and the soil system and heading towards our aquifer. And actually, we've got a very strong signal there. We've got higher amounts of calcium and magnesium, which is the weathering of the rock. And we've got higher alkalinity, which is an indicator of the bicarbonate. So the CO2 drawdown. We've got a higher increase in the basalt plots than in the non-basalt plots. Higher actually than the other 2 sites, which are the grassland sites. And then for the greenhouse gases, we're using a chamber method. You can see again on the left at the top there, one of these boxes in the lab, so the cover on, and then a simple sampling syringe to sample gases into a sealed tube in the case of the field work. You can see that happening actually on the bottom right here. Each of our treatment plots has 4 gas monitoring stations, and then the samples are taken and brought to the lab for analysis. So that's a setup. In a nutshell, I can summarize the results that we've had over 3 crops. There's no effect on crop yields, no significant increase in yield or decrease in yields, which of course is a good thing. There's no increase in the major nutrients. I think David mentioned particularly P and K is present in this material, but we didn't see an increase. Our soils, incidentally, here are quite high in P and K, but if you compare them with the national figures, they're not extraordinarily high. They're about average for what we know is the available P and K in national agricultural soils. We do detect the increase in P and K, though, in the plough layer. So where we're tilling in or min-tilling the basalt, we're showing that increase in the bank, if you like, of P and K, which may then be released and favorable to the crop if we don't supply more fertilizer. I mentioned biodiversity. The earthworms, there's a slight increase in the number of earthworms with basalt, which doesn't seem to be statistically significant, but it's definitely there. And that was interesting to us because, of course, we were concerned, for example, if you put these basalts on, whether the earthworms don't like them for some reason and they're deterred by the presence of basalt, but that seems not to be the case. And so far, there's no change in the soil physical characteristics from the basalt that we've added. And then finally, greenhouse gas exchange. We've monitored, as I say, 3 gases. We've found no increase in CO2 emission, which is a good thing. But we didn't find any significant difference in the nitrous oxide and the methane in this case. So turning to increases, we've got some increases in the copper and molybdenum inside the crop, so taken up by the crop. And we've been monitoring crop quality for that very reason. As David mentioned, there are some elements which are present in the basalt. Nickel, for example, is one of the elements which might be present in these materials, but we find no significant increase in the crop uptake. What we do find an increase in is pH, where our pHs have gone up from about 6 here to 6.5. And another thing about the basalt as compared to lime in terms of its pH effect is it's not as great, but it might last longer because the rock weathers over a longer period than lime reacts. So lime in soil reacts really quite quickly. It's engineered to react pretty quickly, but the lasting effect of pH effect of basalt may last longer on the farm. We also increase some of the elements in the plough layer. I mentioned this before with potassium and phosphorus. Calcium, magnesium, of course, they're in the rock, so you do find an increase in the plough layer. We find a slight increase in total carbon in the second layer that we sampled, so beneath 23 centimeters, but that was not large. I don't actually think there's a real increase in organic carbon or inorganic carbon, indeed, which we also monitor so far in the treatments. There was a decrease. There are some trace metals which decrease in the harvested crops, and these tend to be the cationic metals. So nickel, zinc, and manganese decreased, but only slightly compared to the controls in the crop material itself. But as David mentioned, actually, the opposite effect we found for the oxyanion, which is molybdenum, and its availability increased with increased pH. So I think the effects that we're seeing there are due to the increase in pH due to basalt addition, which can decrease the availability of some cationic metals, but increase the availability of things like molybdenum that occur as anion forms in soil. So in a nutshell, they are our results. As I said, we're busy working on the final data and writing the papers. Lots more to come out, but basically a very strong signal of weathering and also of carbon dioxide fixation in our soils, and no evidence of, if you like, disbenefits or huge increases in crop yields. There may be very small increases, but they're actually quite hard to detect, I think. So in a nutshell, that's what we're doing, and lots more to come this year, particularly from our arable site. And as I say, the grassland sites are coming along slightly later. So we look forward to that. And thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Steve. That was a great insight into the methodology of enhanced rock weathering in practice in the UK, and some of the effects that that this process has been recorded to be seen in our agricultural landscape and soils. So we've got 20 minutes left for questions, so please get your questions in. I'm going to take my chair's privilege to kind of combine some of these questions just to make it a little bit more efficient, and also maybe ask some questions of my own because I find this subject absolutely fascinating. But there's a few questions that have come through about the direct effect on CO2 removal and also nitrous oxide reductions. I mean, it's pretty clear that nitrous oxide emissions from agriculture in the UK are a huge contribution. So I didn't realize that this process had an effect. David, you mentioned that the effect is it ranges largely in scientific literature, anything from 10 to 35% reduction. So I guess the question is, how much effect does, obviously the variation of this process is of the results from this process are quite large. But from sort of an overview, like how much effect do you believe one application does have and could have? And do you have to continue to apply basalt or lime to maintain CO2 removal? And also, is the reduction of nitrous oxide significant within this process? And could that be one of the leaders of implementing it on a larger scale? David, do you want to speak?
Okay, thanks for the question. See if I can break it down to smaller chunks. So what I showed in my talk was with data from our field trials. It wasn't from the literature. So those are actual measurements, and the effect of reducing N2O was anywhere between, I think it was 10 to 37% reduction in cumulative emissions by the end of the year. And probably there's like a sort of double effect there. One is a sort of direct pH effect, but then there's also an effect on the microbial community. So we've been doing soil metagenomics, where we sequence the microbes and also the genes that the microbes are expressing. And we know that it changes the way that the microbes are processing the nitrogen cycle. So it shifts the nitrification to denitrification ratio. And particularly one of the enzymes that's involved is linked to the availability of copper. And it turns out that the release of copper in the from the basalt can actually help drive the reduction in N2O through the microbial processing of the nitrogen cycle. So yeah, so it's and then in terms of sort of thinking about how long lasting this effect would be, one of the things that we did last year was stop treating the bioenergy crop miscanthus in our Corn Belt trial with basalt, and you basically see a persistence of the CO2 effect, of the pH effect, sorry. And so we also saw the persistence of an N2O reduction as well in our bioenergy crop. So, you know, in a sense, because the pH of the soil has a sort of memory. As soon as you stop doing it, it doesn't just bounce back to where it was. You know, it takes time to go back to where it was in terms of acidification. So once you've changed the soil pH, then, you know, you've basically changed your N2O emissions.
Yeah. So it seems like this process has, applying nitrogen fertilizer obviously causes acidification and nitrous oxide emissions. So this process has the ability to mitigate some of the emissions from other processes within the agricultural season.
Yeah, I think that's you know, very much what we're seeing.
And okay, and the sort of next question was, well, actually, sorry, to bring it to Steve. Did you say that you in the UK down at North Wyke that you guys didn't see so much of an effect on nitrous oxide?
Well, I was talking only about the arable system here at Harpenden.
Oh, okay.
I'm not so familiar with their results. I haven't heard of a big decrease in N2O. I think one of the things which is important is whether the N applications are split, because I wasn't involved in the work in the States, but they put on one dose, because that actually promotes a lot of N2O emission. We tend to split our doses so that, you know, you get a lower emission in the first place. And also, as David said, it probably depends a bit on the availability of copper and the effect of pH, because N2O is not the final product. The final product of denitrification is N2. And we know you have more N2 conversion, as David said, with the enzyme that contains copper. And also there tends to be more conversion to N2 gas at higher pH. So maybe you have to go up even higher to get to, you know, the level where you reduce N2O. And actually don't put all your fertilizer on at once, because it's really conducive to losses of N2O.
Yeah. Okay. Brilliant. Thank you. Yeah, the reason I wanted to forward that question to you is because I was wondering whether, climate is a big, if there were studies in the Corn Belt climate must be a large effect on some of these processes. You know, comparing our UK temperate climate, island climate, compared to a larger continental climate. So I guess the next question that can kind of conglomerate a few of them is regarding soil health and the kind of the change of soil characteristics. So how from what you've seen, how large is the effect of soil types to this process? But also it seems like pH plays a significant part. So is this mainly a process for low pH soils? And additionally, does the soil type, so whether it's a clay soil or a more sandy soil, and the silt levels have an effect? How much do these variables, you know, affect the outcome?
I can go first. Yeah, we in our 3 sites we've got. I should have said this really in Harpenden. We have a silty clay loam. At North Wyke we have quite a heavy clay soil, and I don't know exactly the soil type they have in Mid Wales. It's upland grazing. That site in Wales is particularly acid. And so there are issues there in terms of rock weathering. It probably weathers pretty quickly, but at acid pHs, you also have release of CO2. So there are differences between the sites, actually, in this case, purely down to pH, because the Harpenden and North Wyke sites both started at about 6. And the rock applications put us up to about 6.5. And as I mentioned in my presentation, we think that that effect of liming will last, that effect on soil pH will last longer than lime, because lime is very fine and it's designed to react very quickly, and actually it releases CO2, and then the effect is gone. You have to apply lime again. We haven't obviously done this over a long period, but the pHs are staying as high in year 1, right towards the end of year 3. So we think the long-lasting effect is because the rock takes longer to weather, and therefore there'll be also a longer effect on the pH of the soil itself. So yeah, so far we know that there are differences due to pH in particular. We did a little bit of plot work, so not field work, with actually very sandy soil. And that sandy soil was quite different to the Rothamsted Harpenden site, because we had a big benefit of the potassium from the basalt, because of course there's not a lot of clay in the sandy soil. So you know, your soil is going to have an impact, and its nutrient levels will have an impact on whether you see an effect of nutrient addition from basalt, depending on the structure and the minerals and the nutrient status of the soil.
Okay. David, anything to add from a more global perspective?
Yeah, I mean, from a sort of global perspective, you know, in general terms, the best place to do enhanced weathering is in the tropics. The weathering reactions are temperature controlled and kinetic. So if you warm temperatures with high rainfall that flush the soils, sandy soils are kind of ideal, you know, globally, ideal locations for where you'd want to do it. So you know, it's a lot of Southeast Asia, India, places like that where you have abundant basalt, plenty of crops, warm climates would be great. But as you know, Steve's sites in the UK and our sites in continental US showing, it also works pretty well there. But soil type is important. I mean, the soils in the Corn Belt are quite organic rich. You know, they're the probably most heavily managed soils in the world. And I think the farmers are pretty amazed. And we just put rock dust on and got, you know, 16% increase in yield of soybeans. You know, they're pretty gobsmacked by it. We do see, besides pH increases, we do see an increase in cation exchange capacity. And we see one of the interesting things, although it's quite difficult to measure soil organic carbon, one of the things that we don't see is a change in soil organic carbon after 7 years. whereas in the control plots, the soil organic carbon has actually gone down as a result of management practices. So there's some indication that it could stabilize organic carbon, probably through the, as the cations are released, as the calcium magnesium are released from the basalt, it's probably forming complexing agents to form more recalcitrant organic matter. But those processes can be quite slow and difficult to detect. But yeah, there's some suggestion that it could improve organic carbon concentrations in soils too.
Okay, interesting. Now I've got a question here from Andy Howard regarding the danger if you over apply basalt. Could the carbon sequestration bind with could the carbon sequestered bind with soil nitrogen and make less available for crops? So would it potentially affect crop available nitrogen? And would that inadvertently mean higher need for artificial nitrogen? Could that nitrogen effect lead to negativity?
I can say so. In our trials in the US, we actually calculated nitrogen use efficiency, and showed nitrogen use efficiency went up with the basalt treatment. So I don't think we'd expect any binding with nitrogen or anything like that. And there is a danger that if you continue applying the basalt every year, your pH would rise out of a kind of optimum zone for crops. And so, one way to think about this is to think about basalt as a pH management tool, where you maybe put half the application rate on, say 20 tons per hectare, and you do it every other year. Keep an eye on your soil pH and maintain it in the optimum zone, rather than putting the same amount every year repeatedly to try and capture carbon. So you could think about basalt as a sort of pH management tool. As an alternative to lime. And as Steve said, a lot of the time when you put lime down on acid soils, it actually releases CO2 rather than captures it. And it doesn't have these subsidiary elements like silica and other micronutrients that support crop soil health.
I can add to that comment. I think Andy's issue is really thinking about, if you put on a lot of compost, which is very high in carbon, but not much else, that can bind soil nitrogen. But I don't think we can see, David's talking about 7 years, we're talking about 3 years. We can't really see a big increase in soil organic carbon. And we can't see any inorganic carbon in our experiments either. So I think the issue is not there. I don't think it's likely to increase a huge amount of carbon, which is lacking in nitrogen, and therefore bind up some of the soil nitrogen. So I don't think that's an issue. I think perhaps there may be a misunderstanding that the carbon that we're fixing is actually leaving the soil as bicarbonate, as David showed in his diagram, and it goes through the drains to the rivers and then to the ocean. So that's where the carbon is really going, I think, and it's not going to cause this sort of tie-up in the topsoil.
Another question kind of alluding to soil health as well as soil physical chemical properties. Are you guys monitoring soil health indicators? Does this process influence bacterial or fungal dominated soils? What's the sort of wider effect on kind of soil health, and does this process additionally is it additionally affected by soils with an intrinsic sort of health value compared to soils that are more degraded? Or is it more of a chemical reaction and it will kind of be similar across all fields?
Do you want to comment, Steve?
Well, if you look at pH, it's putting us into a better position in terms of soil health. If the soils are acid, we actually bring them back into an optimum zone for production anyway, production agriculture. We're adding some nutrients, which are important, so that's an increase in soil health. The earthworms in the arable sites, as I said, slightly increased, so there's certainly no negative effect on earthworms. And then when it comes to the metagenomics, I think as David has done it with his colleague in Sheffield, it's probably best if David comments on the metagenomics. But I would also say about metagenomics that you have to be you have to be pretty sure that any change is very, very sensitive in picking up any changes, for example, in gene activity or fungal, bacterial, ratios. But the question is always, what's the impact? What's the importance of that, and what's the longevity of that? In other words, is it a permanent change rather than a sort of temporary change? And I think that's the thing we always have to consider when looking at metagenomics. But anyway, David probably knows more about it than me.
Well, just to say, we're kind of using environmental DNA at all of our field sites in the UK. So the upland grassland, lowland grassland, and arable grassland systems. So we're monitoring how it impacts biodiversity, microbial biodiversity. We haven't got the results back yet, but yeah, it's something that we're kind of cognizant of and are monitoring.
Okay, brilliant. And then more on the operational and practical side of this process, how widely available is basalt? Is it, I've heard that Undo have kind of moved a lot of their operations to Canada. Are there limitations in terms of source, processing basalt into a dust? What's the sort of particle size? Does that require a lot of energy? And yeah, like how's the operational side stack up?
So I can comment on this if you like. So in the UK, most of the basalt is mined in mines in Northumbria and Scotland. They're basically mining a strip of Paleozoic basalt. At the moment, there's no limit on production. If the UK government decided they were going to subsidise this or put policies in place to implement it, maybe production would have to increase. In terms of production, for every ton of rock mined, something like 20% of it is too fine and has been stockpiled. And so some of these companies have actually got thousands of tons of rock dust which is stockpiled and not doing anything, or worse, is going into asphalt, and so it's not being used. So there are definitely opportunities for getting hold of it. I would say the costs when we run our field trials, most of the cost is basically transportation, so getting it from Northumbria to the field sites. There's also production sites in central Wales and in southwest England as well. And some farmers are starting to access the material in central Wales for farming. So I think, currently, with relatively low levels of demand, the mining industry can cope. If there was a shift in government policy, which who knows, then maybe we'd have to look again at production rates of production.
At the moment, it's predominantly a byproduct.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And we, to be honest, for our field trial, we use the material pretty much as is. It's screened for a 2 mil sieve, so that we just get the finer fraction. But we don't do any additional mining or grinding. We just use it as a byproduct.
Brilliant. Well, I think with that, we've actually managed to answer all of the questions. Yeah, well done, guys. And thank you so much for your time today. I think it's been really, really eye-opening, and I'm really glad that we've actually seen this from the sort of research and evidence side. We nearly got on board more commercial sort of stakeholders, but I think having this kind of impartial and clear evidence-based overview has been hugely valuable. So thank you so much, Steve, and thank you, David, for your time today.
Pleasure. Thank you for the invitation.
Brilliant. And yeah, thank you to all of the people who attended here today. Have a great day. All right, farewell.